Welcome back. The Committee to Protect Journalists counts Ethiopia amongst the worst jailers of media professionals in Sub-Saharan Africa. The Press Freedom Group says dozens of journalists have been arrested in the country since 2020. The CPJ says there has been an increase in hostility towards the media since the beginning of a civil war in Ethiopia's northern Tigray region. This as authorities attempt to control the narrative around the war. They say at least 63 journalists and media professionals have been arrested in the capital Addis Ababa and 5 other regions. Thousands of civilians are believed to have been killed and millions displaced due to the war. Much of the conflict has progressed outside of the media's gaze. Journalists have been denied access to affected areas. Muthoki Mumo is Sub-Saharan Africa Representative, Committee to Protect Journalists. She joins us now from Nairobi in Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us, Muthoki, much appreciated. So just looking at the figures and that report that we've just mentioned in the introduction, how many journalists have been jailed in Ethiopia to date since the conflict began?
Thank you very much for having me to discuss this subject. Our research shows that since the conflict began in November 2020, at least 63 journalists and media workers have been arrested in Ethiopia. This has happened, as you rightly noted, in Addis Ababa, the capital, but we've also seen journalists either being taken to other regions, for instance, Oromia and Afar region, or being detained in other regions, the Somali region, for instance. And most recently, we documented the arrest of 5 journalists in the rebel-held Tigray region.
And let's talk about Oromia and the far north region, as you mentioned, the peculiarities in the conflict and how it's impacting on those trying to report on what's going on there.
So the journalists, when I mentioned the Oromia and Afar region, these are journalists who were originally arrested in Addis Ababa as part of the research, but they were taken away from Addis Ababa to these other regions where sometimes they were detained without due process, without being produced in court. So that just shows you how the ripple effect goes beyond just the center and to the other regions. And more broadly, the conflict, we think these arrests are an indicator of what is a bigger picture problem. Because one of the concerns we've had as CPJ is you can document the arrested journalists, you can call for the freedom of the arrested journalists, but there's a largely unseen ripple effect on the broader media community, an inevitable self-censorship, a climate of fear that results when people see their colleagues, their friends being arrested for their journalistic work.
And how brazen is the attack on the media and how media freedom itself has deteriorated since 2020?
Well, quite brazen, I would say, because if you look at some of the cases we've documented, these are cases where journalists have been arrested, journalists and media workers have been arrested, and never really charged with an actual crime, detained sometimes for up to several weeks as police and prosecutors say that they need to investigate them on vague allegations, but never actually charging them, just asking for more and more time to hold them behind bars. It's in very few instances where we've seen these arrests materialize into formal charges. So when you see the judicial system being abused in such a manner, not to speak of the people who've been arrested and been detained without access to family or to legal counsel, which we've seen in some of the cases, that's quite blatant, and that sends quite an obvious message to the media community. Again, if you look at the substance, or if you look at what these journalists are accused of, what the police say they're investigating them for, you can see there's a clear link to journalistic work. For instance, there's one case of a journalist who remains detained called Temesgen Desalegn, and Temesgen is accused of leaking secrets, publishing false information through his magazine. And in an argument to deny him bail, the prosecutors actually said, look, we don't want him released because he's going to go on writing. He's going to go on doing this thing that we think is a crime. So that's quite blatant in its connection to journalism.
And we'll talk about what you'd like to see done in the case of Temesgen and the others in just a moment. But I want to go back to understanding the root causes of this, or how you would categorize this. As we mentioned, it's been seen as a struggle for the control of the war narrative. Is it just beyond the facts in terms of atrocities that are committed by both sides? We've seen wide-scale rapes of girls and women and recruiting of young people to join the conflict.
So in terms of discussing the root causes, I would like maybe to take a step back and to emphasize that some of the things we've seen during the war are not unique to the war. There are things that we've seen historically manifesting themselves when authorities try to control the press. So when you talk about internet shutdowns, for instance, that predates the war. When you talk about journalists being arrested and being detained in prolonged pre-trial detention, that's something that predates the war. What we've seen is just an acceleration of an intensification and an increasing in frequency of these types of attacks during the war. Now, why would that happen? We think part of the answer is this intense battle to control the narrative of the war, coming from all sides. What story gets to be told, what this war becomes, what the story of this war becomes, and the people who dissent from, the dominant narrative, whether it's in Addis Ababa, or again, whether it's in Addis Ababa or elsewhere, the people who dissent from that dominant narrative or who are seen to be doing independent journalism are at risk of attacks such as arrests, but we've also seen things like expulsions, and we've also seen physical attacks. Just to emphasize, this is a trend that we've seen in the center, in the capital, but it's also something that we're now seeing based on reports that we're hearing of journalists arrested in Tigray. So the tools, the ways in which journalism is being repressed, these are tools that unfortunately have been used for a long time in Ethiopia. There's just an intensification and an increase in frequency during the war. And we think part of that, again, is the intense battle of narratives about this war.
Muthoki, tell us, this crackdown, is it limited to journalists, or does it include commentators or anyone who speaks out on or against the conflict?
We as CPJ, when we document the cases of people who are detained for speaking out, for expressing themselves, we are focusing on people who we'd call journalists and media workers. So it's difficult for me to speak more broadly what is happening to other regular people expressing themselves, or artists, for instance. What I would say, though, is that when you see journalists being targeted, it's usually a sign of a broader issue in society. It's a symptom of something that goes beyond the journalism community, something that goes beyond the media community.